Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and welcome to this Value in Energy Data session. We are going to be recording the session, so please keep your camera and microphone off, and the recording will be available on YouTube afterwards. Please use the chat for questions, and we'll kind of triage those and get to them at the end of the session. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Andy Moore, who's going to be presenting for us today. So he's the group leader for strategic modeling at Frazer-Nash Consultancy, and his group use system thinking and data science to tackle some of the big decarbonisation problems and kind of high impact policy and strategy challenges. So yeah, very excited to hear what you've got to share with us today, Andy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Hi, everybody online. Hopefully you can see some slides appearing now.
Yeah, we can see them.
Fantastic. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Sam. Hi, everybody online. Very excited to be here. Particularly excited to share this project with everyone. It's something we're about to publish. Frazer-Nash are going to publish an article on this later this month, and it's the first time that anybody outside of Frazer-Nash has seen it. So you're all getting a bit of a sneak preview online before the official publication of this. So what's it all about? This project is about combining two things. Firstly, open energy data and AI techniques. Both of those things you can go and explore after the talk. I'll give you some hints and tips as to where we got all the data from and what techniques we used. We're going to try and solve an energy strategy challenge written on the screen. According to AI, how much of each power generation technology should we in Great Britain try to build in the next 5 to 10 years? You might be thinking, some of you, maybe AI is quite a broad topic to try and apply to this kind of challenge. What kind of AI did you use? Did you try solving this using the latest Gen AI techniques? Well, we didn't. I'll explain what we did in a bit, but we did thought, let's just try and cover that off really briefly. What would AI visualize as the future GB energy mix in a few different ways using Gen AI? So here we put in some prompts into Leonardo AI image generation and see what it thought as its visualization of the future energy mix in the next 10 years for Great Britain. And you kind of get this slightly odd looking, strange mix of wind turbines and some mysterious power plants in the background. It's a bit Salvador Dali-esque, and there's some melting wind turbines there. So I'm not sure I fully buy into that visualization of the future. We also obviously asked ChatGPT for the answer to this, just to check everything that we've done. It's actually, in my opinion, not come up with a too bad, terrible mix of energy generation sources here. We can come back to that maybe at the end of the presentation and just see how good it did. But what we actually did in this project is try to use a technique called reinforcement learning to design the future GB power generation mix. The idea behind that is we want to try and use a technique that does some thinking to develop its own strategy for solving this problem, ideally in a way that gives insight that other techniques can't currently do to try and tackle the problem. So whereas obviously ChatGPT is just using what information it's got available to it, we're going to try and use something a bit smarter and more focused to tackle this particular problem. And you'll see the story of this talk is going to follow the map on the bottom that you might have already seen at the bottom of the slide here. So it's all about open energy data, really, how we can use that to build a simple systems thinking model. I'll talk about that a bit. Then apply some reinforcement learning to that to try and optimize that system, and then talk you through the results and what's next. When did the project come about? As a bit of context and background to this, I'll just briefly mention I work for Frazer-Nash Consultancy. Frazer-Nash operate in the UK and Australia. We're a systems engineering and technology company by background. One of the missions that Frazer-Nash tries to deliver on is to help make lives safe, secure, sustainable, and affordable. And one thing that really strikes home with lots of people that join the business and the work in my group particularly is we want to do things that matter. So challenges like this in the policy space and in the energy transition landscape are really important to us here. A bit about me. Apologies, this picture is about 10 years old now. But I've been working at Frazer-Nash for almost 15 years, working as a data scientist in the data science area. Also have a strong interest in policy and strategy challenges, as Sam mentioned in the intro. one of the personal missions for me is how can we better tackle policy and strategy decision making with the use of advanced modelling techniques. And again, that was part of the inspiration for this project. Also mentioned before, I run a group here called Strategic Modelling. We try to mix advanced modelling, data science techniques with systems thinking to deliver some strategic advice to our clients and to try and tackle some of their most important challenges. Some of our clients are in the energy sector. We work for clients looking at energy system planning, looking at resilience, decarbonisation modelling. What we've learned from some of those clients recently is they have a need to answer their quite serious challenges quite quickly and get a good answer to that quickly. And when they do get an answer to it, they get asked lots of other questions by stakeholders, what if style questions. If they change their assumptions, what would happen? And thirdly, they need to know that in this quite complex and dynamic environment, they've come up with what is the best, lowest cost, right balance of risk strategy for their challenges. And that's really, really difficult to do and something that lots of our clients are still grappling with. The other thing that inspired this project is, as a group and as a business, we're doing lots of other work in reinforcement learning in other sectors. So we're doing some multi-agent reinforcement learning system design. We're also applying reinforcement learning agents on quantum computers, and we've learned quite a lot from the work in the last 5 years over those topics. And one of the main things we learned was actually policy challenges, and energy system policy challenges in particular could benefit from the application of modern reinforcement learning techniques to help to develop robust strategies and also to help provide some additional insight into those problems that you might not have otherwise got through classical modelling or optimization methods. So policy more generally, we see as being characterized, certainly in the policy problems that we do modelling for, by highly complex systems, lots of interrelated parts, lots of uncertainty about the future, and it's volatile as well. So the question that you have on day 1 might change on day 50, day 100. But also they're characterized by this randomness and unpredictability of societal complexity as part of that system as well. The energy policy space, above and beyond that, we try and map those points from the previous slide on. It's got a lot of complexity. So if you have to model this system, you have to consider lots of different components: generation, consumers, transmission, distribution, storage, imports, climate, lots and lots of factors there to consider. It's highly uncertain, and we'll talk about that in a few slides' time. The future demand and different technology options coming into the landscape are changing all the time. So the questions are changing, the system is changing, but also as well, to make it even more complex, societal behaviours are changing. So people are adopting low carbon technologies in different patterns, all around different demographics and at different stages around the country. Some of these challenges are characterised by the energy trilemma. So if you've not heard that, it tries to emphasise the balance that's needed in energy policy between getting the lowest cost system, the lowest emissions system, while still maintaining energy security for consumers. And the size of the challenge here is quite significant. So last year, UK domestic customer spend on electricity was over £30 billion. So there's a large prize to be had if you can try and optimise this system even more. Obviously, around the globe, greenhouse gas emissions are rising still in the UK and the energy system. We're obviously on a downward trajectory, I think, from right in saying that now. Someone correct me later if that's not quite accurate, but there's still a lot of work to be done in the energy sector to reduce emissions further. And then global conflicts are the other complexity factor feeding into this challenge as well. So, I mean, we only saw this week that network cables, undersea network cables between Finland and Germany have been targeted. And certainly in the energy sector, there are risks to security of supply to be considered outside of just high demand, low supply type challenges. So the energy trilemma is a huge challenge. It's a challenge for DESNZ, NESO, Ofgem, local authorities and asset owners around the country. Really, really hard, given the complexity of this system, to test plans against a full suite of future scenarios. It can be really time consuming. Our clients have noted that a lot this year. And, you know, as soon as they do some analysis, it can become out of date quite quickly. So new scenarios can emerge and you need to test those. So how do we produce a single set of generation sources against that uncertain future demand? And we thought we'd try and help tackle some of that challenge by attempting to answer this question that I put up before. I wanted to highlight briefly this early stage, why the 5 to 10 year bit of that question. And the chart here just shows electricity demand in the future. There's a huge spread of different scenarios. We just collected, I'll explain where these scenarios come from in a few slides time. Lots of different future projections of electricity demand in GB. The spread is massive. And for me, trying to come up with a policy plan that helps to predict the perfect solution to this challenge from now until 2050 is not, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, it's a good idea to go and do, but really we ought to be focusing our efforts on what to do right now, because you can always reevaluate that in 5 years' time. So we want to try and come up with some no regret options to inform power generation policy that if you make now, in 5 to 10 years' time, you're not going to regret them, because the future is going to evolve slightly differently than you predicted. They're going to be things that are good decisions no matter what happens with that future. But the primary aim, as listed on the left of the slide here, is to really test the usefulness of AI on a complex policy challenge like this. So this is a project that's, just for clarity, is funded. It's a research project within Fraser-Nash. We just hope that this is something useful and it inspires a few people on the call or on YouTube later to go and tackle the energy trilemma problem in perhaps a different way. Or maybe you've seen something today where you've seen reinforcement learning in action and you have your own challenge where you can apply that type of technology as a solution. So what am I going to talk about for the rest of this talk? We're going to combine open energy data, that's the first section, into a really simple systems model of the electricity system around Great Britain. And then we're going to apply some AI reinforcement learning agents to try and optimize that system and develop a good plan for power generation in Great Britain. One of the benefits of using reinforcement learning as an option for this is that as the system is going to change and evolve over the future, hopefully we've got a tool that can go and update that power generation plan, because it's quite agile and it can just be reapplied when the system changes, as opposed to fully re-optimizing the whole system over again. Let's dive in. Open energy data. There's lots of great stuff out there. I'm not going to read out the references. They're here. You'll get a copy of the slide pack later. So if you want to go and dig into some of these references, feel free. Here's where we got things from. Let's look at capacities first. So we're going to build a simple systems model of the electricity network in the UK. First place that I'd recommend you go for that is have a look at Dukes. So the Digestive UK Energy Statistics. It's fantastic. It's published every year. If you've never heard of it, around July time every year, DESNZ publish a new version of this. It's just on the government website. You can go and find it. It's got great electricity flow charts. If you're a data visualization or energy system nerd like me, you love opening this up every year, looking at exactly where all the major power plants are in the UK. You can go and look at the distribution network operating areas and all the transmission system as well. It's really fantastic at highlighting the energy system as it stands the previous year. So what we learned from this for this project, 313 terawatt hours was over the last 5 years the average electricity generation in GB. Lots of this from renewable sources, and that's growing year on year. You can't see this in the bottom. What I've tried to highlight here is they output really great series of Excel tables in the annex for Dukes, and you can see here it just lists all the major power producers and some of the smaller ones as well. So what we can extract from this for our energy system model is all the plant capacities broken down by year, fuel type, and all of the electricity generated by those by year and by fuel type, going back at least a decade or so. We're obviously more interested in more recent electricity generation from the previous year that was published. So we extracted the data from 2023, had a look at what we're doing as a country, producing electricity, what the total capacity of the system is, and also what was actually generated to meet demand. One of the things I'll do with all the open energy data is just explain a few gotchas in case you try and build a system yourself using these data sources. One of the things that you'll find here that's maybe you need to read up on these data sources and read the README files that come with them. You learn that things like solar and wind wave energy are all derated capacity. So although the capacity, the true capacity of, say, the wind farm might be very, very large, I think realistically looking at the wind profile that's experienced by that wind farm, you're not realistically going to get wind generating all the time. So they've derated it by certain factors to account for that. So you can now compare different energy sources like for like, and you know that your solar panel is probably not going to be generating much at night time. So equally, that's been derated. The next thing is consumer demand. So here we looked at first the FES, Future Energy Scenario publication by NESO now. And in NESO's own words, the FES creates a foundation upon which our future network investment plans will be built. So again, published around July time every year. This is an absolutely fantastic publication for anyone interested in the outlook for the energy system in the UK and Great Britain as well. And what they do is publish a series of pathways this year. So these are essentially ways that we can design and build an energy system to meet different potential scenarios that we might experience. Because again, they're not trying to perfectly predict exactly what's going to happen in the future, but they're making sure there are different design options and a counterfactual as well, where we don't meet net zero. And so I've just shown here on the slide, I'm not expecting you to read them all, but just to highlight that there's different pathways that are published. They also have some great Sankey diagrams about the system, so you can go and look at where our energy is being produced right now, how it's being used up. And then they do the same sort of thing for the pathways. So here's one of the pathways for 2050 and how you can go and see directly how the energy system is potentially going to change if these scenarios happen and if we follow that particular pathway. And one of the great things that they publish alongside this is not only the publication itself, but this really great data workbook. So if you're doing any energy policy modeling or anything similar to this kind of project in the future, highly recommend you dig into this workbook. It's got some fantastic pivot tables in it. You can go and down select different pathways, different energy vectors, different generation types, and go and look into all that data. So what we did for our project here, we needed to understand what is the electricity demand potentially going to look like in the future. We combined the future energy scenarios, some of the pathways and scenarios from the previous couple of years, because there was a subtle change to it in 2024. So we had a look at some of the broader set of potential pathways from previous years as well, combined them with some climate change committee scenarios and some DESNZ projections as well. And the immediate thing you can see is there's a huge amount of uncertainty here. So feasibly by 2050, electricity demand could more than double. Could potentially go even higher than that, or it might just increase by a slightly smaller percentage. We just don't know. Lots of different things can happen in the future. So what we did is take all those scenarios, put a big bound around them, and so for our model that we're going to build, we're allowing it to go and sample from these different future scenarios because we want to make sure that we can account for the uncertainty in future demand. So one thing to be aware of here, there's a subtle difference between a scenario and a forecast. So what NESO are doing with their pathways is not necessarily forecasting how the electricity system is going to change, but rather setting a pathway for how it could be designed. However, for the electricity demand data, we have taken that as a potential scenario forecast, and equally with the DESNZ projections and climate change committee, we're treating that in our model as a forecast because we think that's appropriate. But yes, the main challenge from this is that given the huge amount of uncertainty in future demand, how do we ensure that a single generation mix is best and can be appropriately applied to all those different kinds of situations that we might find ourselves in? So the next part of the data is the costs. We wanted to use a simple long-term indicator for costs. So we took for this project the levelized cost of electricity as a means to compare on a like-for-like basis the total generation costs over a long period of time. I'm not going to read out the full definition, but the LCOE has its critics, it has its things it's good for, it has its things that it's not so good for. So we wanted to make sure that for this particular project and its use case, it was appropriate. There are obviously lots of assumptions in using a metric like the LCOE, but yeah, we needed to take some data for yeah, thank you whoever clapped then. I didn't quite see who it was, but yeah, it's not a perfect metric, and I've tried to highlight some of that stuff on this slide. Some of the LCOE gotchas, cost conversions is the first thing that you need to be careful of. The 2023 DESNZ dataset does contain many technologies in pounds from 2021. So if you're not familiar with this terminology in economics, it's just the value of the pound in 2021, which obviously changes due to inflation over time. However, some of the other technologies that we needed to have a look at were using data from the 2020 or the 2016 versions of that workbook. So while the workbook itself is really good, highlights lots of key information, is very useful, we did need to use some ONS GDP deflators to try and make sure that all the technologies are on the same basis, so you can compare like for like on a 2021 pound note scale. The other thing about LCOE, which is, again, probably the most important thing here, transmission and distribution costs are obviously not accounted for in the LCOE, but of a particular power generation technology. So, you can imagine a system that's built that needs to make the system work, you might need to massively increase the investment in transmission and distribution to make sure the electricity can get from where it's generated to where it needs to be. The LCOE does not account for that. Also doesn't account for the extra environmental costs, or perhaps some of the different security costs and benefits of different technologies. It's just something that's outside of this metric. It also doesn't account for how dispatchable the energy is, or wider energy system benefits. For example, if you need to, if NESO operating and system operator managing the grid needs a frequency response on it, you can't get that from certain technologies. You might need a CCGT plant to provide that frequency response. This doesn't tell you as a metric the value that you get from that frequency response dispatch. That needs to be accounted for separately. Also, to be careful of, the values here are very uncertain and variable between projects. So even within a given technology, there's a lot of variability, and you can see that changing over time if you look at some of the underlying data. So statistically, you'd call it heteroscedastic. Why is that important? It just means that if you're trying to compare multiple technology options over time, there's a difference in the risk profile of one technology compared to another. So introducing one technology which has an increasing variability in costs compared to an alternative with a decreasing variability in costs over time means that you're taking on a completely different risk profile that's not accounted for unless you look at the variability on the underlying data. So again, for our purposes, we're trying to, if you think back to the aims of this project, we're trying to use this particular type of AI to solve a challenge like this. We've basically decided that we're going to ignore that variability for now. It's something that we'll probably come back to in the future to try and make the solution even more robust. But we just want to be aware of, particularly if you're taking LCOE data and using that for your own projects. So finally, we need to look at greenhouse gas emissions from different technologies, the other part of the energy trilemma. So we had a look at the very good report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and we want to have a look at the full life cycle emissions of all our electricity generation technologies. So that's taking it all the way from primary energy through any transport that's needed. Obviously, some technologies need that, some don't. If you compare natural gas to solar on the screen, any conversions, and then finally transport to the grid. So we're trying to do that on a like-for-like basis. The data underpinning this, we thought was the best that we could find for this particular project. Be interested to hear other people's views if they looked at other data sources that compare these technologies on a like-for-like basis. And that equally has some gotchas just to be aware of. If you're going to take this data and go and use it for something else, again, the values are highly variable between projects, both for the project itself, and then if you look at the operating profile of even a gas plant, depending on how they operate, that impacts the life cycle emissions of that particular plant. And you might find that a plant is designed for one thing and then operates differently in the future. What we've done here, again, quite simple and straightforward to prove the technology case. There's a feasibility study. We've taken the central estimate. So we've also not accounted for here right now the predicted change in future emissions due to potential technology improvements. And again, this is part of the philosophy behind the work that we try to do here. Similar with the costs. What we're trying to base our results on is evidence that has happened from emissions and cost data that we had in the past. And that's why, this list of technology options on the left, we'll come back to this in the systems thinking part, doesn't include every possible energy generation technology or storage technology that you might expect. But if you look at NESO's future energy scenarios, for example, they're looking at how hydrogen gets included into the mix, how battery energy storage technologies and large-scale long-term battery storage technologies are included. What we were trying to do with this project when we designed it was to have a look at proven historical technologies that we had this life cycle emissions data for, and we had equivalent cost data for. So something certainly be interesting when we get to the results. We know that we're going to come back to some of this stuff and explore what if, with all those other technologies we introduce, you could also introduce some other different types of, for example, advanced nuclear and other future technologies as well, how that would change the answer. So that's the data. Let's have a look at how we built this simple systems model. So firstly, I'll introduce a concept called systems thinking, which isn't hugely widespread. So I just thought I'd focus on it for one slide. We define a system as having three things: purpose, parts, and then relationship between those parts. And the system produces its own behavior over time. And we use a technique called systems thinking within our consultancy to try and address challenges with uncertain, complex, volatile systems like this. And there's an approach that you can use for this that I'll talk about. If you're interested in systems thinking, I can't go into too much detail on this particular webinar because there's just not enough time, unfortunately. Recommend picking up this book, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. She's one of the pioneers and regarded very highly in the systems thinking world as someone that has done some great work in systems thinking. This book is fantastic. You can go and pick it up after the call if you're really interested. One of the things that she discusses is the concept of leverage points. So that's where you can make a small change to the system that can have a large effect on the outcome. And for policy decisions, this is exactly what we're trying to do for a complex system. We're trying to not have too much of a cost associated with the policy decision, but also you want something to make a small injection of something to have a big effect, positive effect on the outcome. The problem is, as Donella talks about quite a lot in Thinking in Systems, leverage points can be really counterintuitive, and humans, particularly in the policy space, can be very bad at finding leverage points through intuition alone. So we want to, in this project, try and do a bit better. Great example of that in history is using Cobra economics. So if you've not heard of this before, this is the term coined from the scenario that happened in the 1800s over in India. So the British government were desperately trying to find a solution through policy to the challenge they were having there. Basically, lots and lots of cobras in India were going around biting people. It wasn't great for their economy at the time and their health for lots of reasons, I imagine. So the kind of leverage point that they thought of using, the policy that they injected, was to offer a reward to people if they brought them some dead cobras. Here, have some money. Lots of smart but poor people in India at the time thought, great, I'm going to build a cobra farm in my basement, kill all the cobras, hand them in, and get paid lots and lots of money. And this worked really well for the people for quite a long time until the government obviously realized what was going on, thought, this is terrible, let's cut off that, we can't be doing this anymore. So what do the people do? There are lots of living cobras in their basement being farmed. They're not going to kill them now, they just release them out into the wild. So all that happened in that scenario in the Cobra economics world was lots of money was spent giving people rewards, and the ultimate outcome of it was lots more cobras are now in the wild. So it's not so great sometimes trying to use just intuition to think of the right leverage point. So we want to try and do a bit better, and we can hopefully use systems thinking to try and help with that. Within my group, we do bits of system thinking with clients to help build models and tackle complex problems. And if you yourself have a particularly complex, uncertain, volatile problem to deal with, you could do a lot worse than using the steps outlined on the screen. So the first step is to understand the purpose and the parts of the system. Then you want to understand how they relate to each other and form a whole. You can experiment and optimize with that system that you've helped to build, and then try and, well, equally, once you try to optimize it, hopefully probably using either a model of that system, perhaps a computer model, or equally you could just use a pen and paper to draw this system out. You want to then test and validate that to make sure that you're addressing the original question and you've got a robust and fit for purpose answer. So we're going to try and do that process loosely to design our simple systems model of the electricity system. So what's the purpose? We want to build an energy system model to train our AI to find good leverage points for policy. What are the parts? The electricity system is very complex. There are lots of different parts. So we need to really carefully consider which parts of this system we want to introduce into our model. Lots of different technologies. I spoke on the previous slide. There's lots of future technology options as well, lots of current technology options, different construction timescales, complex market pricing dynamics as well going on in the electricity industry, and equally lots and lots of randomness. There's uncertainty in future electricity demand, faults, maintenance events, but just patterns in the weather can affect the system as well. Key question when you're building any model is, well, firstly, what question you're trying to answer, but secondly, what's the right level of granularity and detail do you need to answer the question? And again, bring us back to our aim of this project was to try and prove the case for reinforcement learning to tackle complex policy challenges. So what we try to do here is to build a system that was the right level of detail for us to tackle this particular challenge. So we took a clustered mix of proven technology options, gas, wind, onshore and offshore, nuclear gigawatt scale. And you'll see here a lot of the technology options are from a few years ago when we had the good data for the LCOE and the emissions data that we used to build the system. So we could compare it on a like-for-like basis. There's lots of technology options that have grown massively, like battery energy storage in the last few years that are not on here. And that's something that'll be really key to try and understand how would that technology, if it's deployed at a larger scale and it develops further over the next few years, change the answers to this problem. So we did exclude some whole system effects from the provision of heat or different future technologies here as well. I'll just emphasize that point again. And we wanted something that traded off speed of calculation with complexity. So we use an approximate model for electricity market pricing mechanisms to try and do that. So I'll try and explain those relationships and what we did in the model. It was deliberately fast and light so that we could quickly test policy ideas and try and optimize a strategy for the energy trilemma. So it simply follows a time-stepping routine to calculate costs and emissions associated with the electricity supplied and the selected technologies on an hourly basis from now until 2050. Each time step, it's looking at what technologies are going to be dispatched with our simple market dispatch dynamic model. And it just adds that to a timeline of cost and CO2. And again, this is where you might look back at those slides and comments before on the LCOE. LCOE is looking at the whole lifetime cost. So this is a project looking at accumulating the whole cost of these systems and technologies and comparing them on a very long time scale, so we can try and optimize a system over the long run, not just for the short term as well. But clearly there are some approximations in here that we think are justified for this work, but equally could be improved upon further, which we'll talk about towards the end. So again, we're not expecting perfection at this part of the project from this model. There are very good established dispatch models, lots and lots in fact, that we can easily swap into this project later. What we want to try and do with this is something good enough for testing the feasibility of our AI approach on the system. So to build some confidence in it, we still wanted to do some testing and really quick validation of it though. So we knew how much we could trust it. And we were reasonably surprised, not surprised, but reasonably happy with the comparisons that we got. We ran a simulation of electricity demand from 2022 and then ran that total demand through our simple simulator and dispatch model. And there are obviously some differences here. You can pick a few out. One of the key differences is just due to we still randomly simulated the way. We didn't use the weather from 2022 as an input to the model. We randomly simulated the weather changing over time. And so the weather that we simulated wasn't quite the same as the real weather. So there's differences in the amount of wind. Solar was a little bit different. Wind was a bit different. We're using approximations in a few places for the dispatch algorithm. It's not a full economic dispatch, considering all different kinds of things like transmission and distribution on the system. And we're not including absolutely all of the technologies here. So some of the other category of the actual dispatch electricity was absorbed by some of the technologies that we were including in the system. But overall, broadly speaking, we were pretty happy with the high level comparison of the mix of technologies and the ratios that we were dispatching in our simulation compared to what actually happened in 2022. So now we've got a model. What we're going to do with it, we can try and manually run a demand scenario to see the cost and emission outcomes. We can do it better than that, though. We can pick our best guess at a future demand scenario and try and optimize the best technologies to build and when. We can do even better than that, and this is where I see a lot of work in the industry going on right now. We can try and come up with what's described as a robust strategy by running thousands of possible demand scenarios, weather combinations, market conditions, etc., and try and optimize across all of these. So this is called a robust strategy development approach because it's not trying to perfectly predict the absolute optimum strategy for one given version of the future. This is accepting the premise that we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so you're optimizing against an uncertain future to get a robust strategy that works across the whole suite of possible future scenarios. And that's quite a key concept in what we want to try and do here. Why is that not quite good enough for what we want to try and do? So we could optimize to produce a robust strategy, and that's done in the industry right now using classical optimization approaches. However, my feeling is good strategy recognizes that the real world is constantly changing, and we need to have an approach that's adaptable and can quickly evolve to that changing landscape. So we need to be able to rerun that optimization very, very quickly as things change. You have that volatility element amongst the uncertainty of the future scenarios. And secondly, is there just another technique here that can give us some more insights? Maybe using different techniques, you get different kinds of policy and strategy insights from using them. And is that possible? And we think that AI, specifically reinforcement learning here, is the right tool to use to try and address those two challenges with current robust strategy development methods. And the way I'll introduce reinforcement learning over the next few slides or so and talk about the results. The way I like to try and understand what's happening in reinforcement learning, if you've never heard of it before, is the story of Google's DeepMind's AlphaGo technique that made this technique famous. So Go is an ancient game of strategy. It's more than 2,500 years old, originated in China, I believe. Unlike chess, though, where we have really good chess computers, built maybe 20 years or 30 years ago now, they can just brute force all the different chess permutations for a given game. Go is far more complicated than that. I believe it's maybe, someone can count the beans on the screen. There's probably, I think it's a 17 by 17 grid, and there are more combinations to try and brute force through than there are atoms in the universe. So you can't use classical techniques to try and do this. So the best Go computer programs could only really play at amateur level before AlphaGo came along. But what they did was to use reinforcement learning to build AlphaGo. And it was the first machine to beat Go world champion. They use a grading system, a bit like in martial arts. So there's a 9th Dan Go world champion that they beat. Was able to really, really quickly, once trying to make decisions, to try and make good playing decisions no matter what board you put in front of it. It didn't have to go and calculate away for hours and hours and hours. It was instantaneous. And what was really exciting to me about AlphaGo is that it developed strategies that are still talked about to this day. So again, it's a 2,500-year-old game. It came up with strategies that grandmasters had never seen before. So it identified new leverage points in the Go system, new ways of playing that were better than humans had derived from 2,500 years of playing. And that, to me, is quite exciting because not only is it coming up with new insights on what is, a classical game, AlphaGo and DeepMind then turn their eyes to focus on computer games. And really, a computer game is just a simulation of something fun happening. what we can do is through our work, we've been developing simulations for businesses and systems and policy simulations. We can apply reinforcement learning techniques to those systems to try and come up with new insights that had never been seen before. So we think there's a strong connection between the problem and this particular way of solving it. So let's talk about some terminology of reinforcement learning for a few minutes. An RL teaches an agent, so I've tried to depict that with the little AI silhouette on the right. Optimal behavior policies. So policy is not a policy like in government. Policy is a map, a sort of a map within the agent that helps to identify what decisions it should make. And it does that in an environment to obtain maximum long-term reward. So it's not trying to just get some quick wins here. It's trying to focus on the long term, what's the maximum reward it can get. And it does that through interactions with that environment. It observes it and how it responds. So one way I like to describe how RL works is with the analogy of like training a dog. So a dog, the agent, can't speak English. So we need to teach it using rewards or punishments. And that's what we do in RL. So the dog observes its surroundings, the environment. It might look at your position, your tone of voice, and that's the state. And if the action that it performs is correct, if you're telling it to sit and it does sit, you might reward it with a treat. And in RL, that's mathematical. We just give it a nice mathematical reward to help train its function. But over time, that good behavior is reinforced, hence the name reinforcement learning. And the dog learns what patterns of behavior or policies it should try and do to achieve the greatest long-term reward. So let's try and map that to our energy system problem. We had this picture from before with RL included now. So the agent follows quite a straightforward pattern of behavior in training mode. So it'll first observe the state of the system. So what technology is there right now? What was the demand in the previous year, for example? What capacities of technology exist? It'll then take an action. So that action is to decide whether to increase and build more infrastructure of a particular technology type. You'll go to number 3, calculate the reward and receive that reward. And then internally, it will build up over time, going around this loop millions and millions of times, build up that map of policy and how it's going to perform the best decisions in different environments. So to take that to a slightly deeper, more complex level now, within the agent, within the particular agent that we use, there are 2 deep neural networks at play. These are terms that are commonly used within modern RL algorithms now. There's an actor deep neural network and a critic. So the actor tries to use its policy to predict and choose the effectiveness of a given state that it's observed and the action it can take. And then the critic tries to take that state action pair. So you can imagine, if you want to visualize this in your head, a sort of a matrix between it's seen a state and what action should it take, and predict the long-term reward on that. And that's used to help to improve the actor DNN, which is what is used to make policy decisions. It's just a ways and means of improving the training much faster. We've also included a few other tricks in our RL agent to make it even better. So it's got a thing called a replay buffer. So that tries to take old states and resamples from them so it can learn a bit faster. And also it has some extra DNNs. So it's now got 4 DNNs in place, some target DNNs, and that helps to stabilize the learning. So it's not just learning off its most recent observations. It's learning off lots of historical information in the replay buffer and using the target DNNs to try and stabilize that learning over time. Let's talk about the actual learning that we perform then. So training this agent that we're going to see the results from took a few days. We used something called a bit analogous to transfer learning, where you train an agent on an older problem and then start off with that same agent and retrain it on a slightly updated new problem here. So what we did here was about 100, I think it's 103 epochs of training. One epoch is 16,000 simulated years of training. So that's we went around that cycle on the right every year from now till 2050, 16,000 times, and that's one epoch. and we did over 100 epochs on this particular agent. So, 1.5 million years worth of simulated training. And you can see it starts to do, it's actually quite badly initially. And that's because what I'll talk about in a minute is the exploitation, exploration trade-off that you have with these agents. It might take a few random steps to try and learn and build its policy map a bit better, starts to get a bit worse, starts to get a bit better, gets a bit worse again, eventually forms a stable state where it's predicting a good average reward that's consistent over time. It seems to have tried to minimize the result of its optimization. Some gotchas with this as well. Reward function design, particularly complex with this, took a lot of experimentation from the team to try and get this right. So it's got to consider cost emissions. It doesn't want to overbuild technology. So if you've got too much on the grid, equally that's going to cost a lot more money. Unmet demand, how do you price that? Do you price it the same as overbuilding technology? We've got to consider that quite carefully. There's lots of different algorithms to be chosen from. If you're interested to read up a bit more after the talk, have a look at, we use a DDPG algorithm, Deep Deterministic Policy Gradient, as the algorithm for this one, because at the time that seemed the most promising. Since we've done the work, actually, there's quite a lot more algorithms being developed constantly. PPO is a pretty good one. Soft Act Critic, SAC, is another good one to have a look at. So go and, encourage people to go and have a look afterwards at what's available. And then finally, as talked about, counterintuitively, you have this exploitation trade-off, and sometimes adding noise and randomness to the agent's decision can actually help it to improve, because it avoids some local minima in the optimization. It can just help it to test its policy in more different scenarios and the decisions it will make, so it doesn't get focused in too heavily before it's fully exploited its optimal policy map. So I've taken away some parts of this diagram now. So now we've trained it, we can start to use it and see what it does. And as time is getting on, I'll jump quickly into the results. So according to our AI, how much of each technology should we build in the next 5 to 10 years? This is what it came up with. So I've tried to show on the left a couple of different demand scenarios. So you can throw lots of different demand scenarios at this, and it will show you what it would have done under those situations. And it doesn't see ahead what the demand scenario is going to be. It only looks back at what happened the previous year and then builds out the next few years and changes its mind occasionally. So yeah, here's what it would do on a really low one. Here's what it would do on a really high one. We've got a big increase in wind capacity that it's trying to build by 2030. Reasonable increase in solar capacity, quite a big relative increase in nuclear capacity, and some other small renewables as well on top of that. In both the scenarios, it reduced the emissions quite high. I think not quite as low as NESO might like in some of their particular pathways. We don't have any carbon capture and storage technology on our grid of technologies yet to try and help with that. What does that mean in terms of costs? So how do we calculate how much this would have saved if you took this particular route, and how much carbon and how much pound note cost savings it would take? So we compared it to a business as usual counterfactual scenario. So for that, again, difficult choice. How do you define what business as usual counterfactual might be? We just took the proportions of technologies on the grid right now and extrapolated those out in the same proportion over time to see that, if you did something better than just using the same proportions as we currently have on the 2023 electricity grid, how would you do in terms of cost and CO2? Again, just to highlight the caveat here, this is purely based off long-term LCOE metrics, so it's not accounting for the transmission distribution costs that you really ought to account for if you're properly designing this system, because the placement of technology makes a big difference, and you should really start to think about that. Finally, we thought, is this actually any good? Like, is this vision of this feature by the AI reinforcement learning agent good or not? We thought we'd compare to the more detailed modelling that NESO and DESNZ have performed. So in the UK government's recent net zero growth plan, it has 50 gigawatts offshore wind by 2030. And that's surprisingly very, very similar to what our AI predicted, like very, very close, in fact. NESO are saying rapid growth in wind and solar, small increase in long-term, long-duration energy storage. I've put some ticks and colours next to some of these technologies and tried to do a bit of a comparison. what you realize is, so we didn't quite, our AI didn't build quite as much solar power as expected in some of the NESO advice to government recently. And that's probably because the price of solar power expected to reduce over the next decade quite strongly, but we just decided to take historical facts as, this is historical prices and what we've got from the LCOE data that we have. So we've not yet accounted for potential changes in price over time, which will be a useful thing to go and explore. What I thought was really interesting, though, is its risk mitigation approach of uncertain future demands. So we did end up seeing in the AI built a lot, well, not a lot more, quite a bit more, maybe 60% extra nuclear capacity on the grid than our current strategy from government. I thought that was quite interesting. I think what that highlighted to me is maybe this insight into different strategy options that you've got. I think what the AI was trying to do is mitigate that risk of future demand either being lower than expected, in which case it's much easier to build less solar and wind capacity than it is to build less nuclear, because nuclear just takes a long time to build at the moment. And equally, if demand's higher than expected, you can't go back in time 10 years and start building a new nuclear station, but it is much faster to put more solar and wind on the grid. So that might be an interesting risk mitigation approach it was taking there. However, that big caveat again, third bullet point, just be aware that this is a feasibility test and we haven't fully validated this approach or the model. There's things missing. So please do not trust these results over really detailed and useful DESNZ and NESO long-term modeling of the system. How do we get the benefits? I'm not going to dwell on this slide. What I'm going to do is tell you about the article we're publishing on this later this month, that if you want to pick up the slides after the talk today, I think Energy Systems Catapult are going to share this, so feel free to dig into this. But at a high level, yeah, we need to look at requirements first and look at exactly how we ought to be planning this thing, introduce more technologies that we talked about. So lots of long duration energy storage, for example, is a classic one that we need to integrate into this. More short-term accuracy of technology build rate. The LCOE just captures a big broad brush view of the costs here. We need to really look at planning, commissioning, operational costs, decommissioning costs separately to get the timing right on some of these decisions. And equally, actually, once you've got that and you've tested and validated it properly, you can use this for more spatial planning and whole energy system approaches. So not just electricity system, but actually whole energy system, including heat. So I tried to highlight that here quickly. We have a tool that we think can be used to rapidly re-optimize for strategy insight problems in the energy industry. So network infrastructure planning. There's lots of work going on by NESO now to redesign how they do network options assessment studies from previously, what to invest in from infrastructure. We could use this against that. If you're an investor in particular technology, how do you know how useful that technology will be on the grid? You could easily just inject your technology into a model like this, and the reinforcement learning agent would hopefully act in a way that's rational to see what level it should be integrated into. And then finally, for resilience planning, how do we optimize and design the grid in such a way it's robust to external shocks at a given resilience standard level, and where might the vulnerabilities be? So yeah, wrapping up as a summary of the work, I think we aim to test the usefulness of an AI reinforcement learning agent on a complex policy challenge and come up with some no regret options over the next 5 to 10 years that we could integrate. Key takeaways from me: reinforcement learning, I strongly believe, can be used to develop robust policy strategies for environments like energy. So it's not just something that's going to be good in one given version of the future. We can model probabilistically. We looked at, trained on 1.6 million different scenarios. You can use it to develop robust policy and go and explore it across lots of different scenarios. Alternative strategies and insights might be gained from using this technique. And finally, there's the potential to answer policy questions much faster than traditional whole system optimization methods. So promise the very final slide, apart from my thank you slide, is just to say, yeah, this was only possible due to the valuable open energy data that's out there, things like Duke, the FES, the IPCC data. We can't do innovation projects and research like this off our own bat if we don't have access to this data openly. This is not something that DESNZ said or NISO said, come and do this work, here's a load of data that we can hand over in-house. This was only using open access data online. So without that data, we can't start to run projects like this. If you're interested in the work, encourage you, once it's published, hopefully very soon, later this month, this article using AI to design GB's future energy power generation mix. So that's it from me. Sam, hopefully you're not going to tell me off too much because we have, what, 3 minutes left before you need to go?
Three minutes left. Thanks very much, Andy. I'm going to pull together some of the bigger picture questions, which are really around the in Go, you have like lots of permutations, whereas actually in kind of like selecting electricity mix, you don't have quite so many. And kind of there are other optimization techniques out there, etc. Like, what basis would you have for expecting reinforcement learning to perform better than traditional techniques?
Yeah, really, really good question. My belief is you can get a more accurate answer to a very specific scenario question, or even like if you've got a good grasp of all the different probabilistic future scenarios that are out there. So just a quick count. I still think there is, when you're looking at all the different weather patterns that can exist, all the different scenarios around European energy through interconnectors that could exist, not least of which then the future demand scenarios at different parts of the country. There's a huge possible permutation matrix of different scenario options that you could have here. And then I think it's still millions. So it's still a lot to try and optimize against, whereas actually this pattern of reinforcement learning can help with that. But yeah, you could get a slightly more accurate strategy for any one of given those situations using classical methods. I think the power of reinforcement learning comes in where that method changes. So it's quite volatile, like I was discussing in the talk. So you're gonna do that classical optimization, which might take quite a long time to do because it's quite a complex system to optimize over. And then a month later, you're going to get a what if question, or it's going to change, or a new technology is going to be introduced, and you're going to have to assess against that. The power of this is you pre-trained your model over a long period of time, which you can then just roll out on that new question. So it's all embedded in the maths of the agent within the DNNs. So you can then go and say, okay, well, what if this scenario, what if the demand suddenly ticks down then up in 20, whatever, 35, 45, let's just run that. We don't have to re-optimize against that scenario. We can just rerun it. And the second thing is that insights piece. So here, what I learned from this is actually, I hadn't really thought about the risk mitigation option with building more nuclear slightly faster than we had done before. That was an interesting insight for me from this. Again, this was just a feasibility study as well. So I'd like to see, like in the Go example, new strategies were developed. Can you employ reinforcement learning and get some insights that you wouldn't have had using classical optimization? Can it devise a strategy through its exploration routines that you wouldn't have seen otherwise?
Great, and we'll take one more question and then finish, which is some people kind of like trying to understand the difference with traditional optimization. So saying like there's still an underlying traditional optimization model in the approach, right? Is that true? If not, like, can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it is very analogous. So I always think of like different optimization approach, and you've got a complex system. You might use some, I don't know, like particle swarm optimization or something. And really you can visualize how the agent is optimizing itself in a similar manner. So again, I'd love to have a picture of this, but in essentially you're trying to find a minimum in a really complex hyperplane of different parameters. And so your agent in this case is a bit like any other optimizer. It's just trying to look at the gradients of the surface, the hypersurface it's looking through, and trying to find the minimums without finding a local minimum, trying to find an overall global minimum to that surface. And the reinforcement learning agent is also trying to do that same problem. It's the surface it's optimizing over, though, is the one of policy. So it's trying to learn to make good decisions on a good future system. It's not trying to design the policy itself right away and optimize that given policy for a given situation. Its thing it's optimizing over is a decision-making engine, if for want of a better phrase. So it's optimizing its own decision logic so that you can throw it at a new unseen situation and you can hopefully see that it will make a good, sensible decision. And yes, you might need to build some trust in its decision-making process afterwards, but there's a hard to explain, but hopefully that there is a subtle difference in what you're optimizing on. But yeah, there's lots of classical optimization technology embedded in the agent's DNNs, those 4 DNNs I talked about. You're still trying to minimize a function ultimately.
Great, thanks, Andy. And obviously loads of questions that we didn't get to. So if you are kind of like really engaged with this and want to find out more, do just reach out to Andy and have a chat. The recording and slides will be circulated afterwards, so you can catch up on those. But thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, please reach out and hopefully talk to some of you soon.